nothing to do with so-called subsidies. There has been not a cent of subsidy here. It has nothing to do with this. We are hit because a giant, itself created, fed by decades of government support in the US, has decided to eliminate a competitor that makes better products. It's as simple as that.
So there was outrage in Quebec and on Parliament Hill today over new U.S. duties on Bombardier jets, but tensions over each country's aerospace industries have been bubbling under the surface for quite some time. It started with Bombardier's deal to sell 125 of its C-Series planes to Delta Airlines. Boeing complained that big government subsidies allow Bombardier to dump its aircraft in the U.S. at rock-bottom prices. But Bombardier argues Boeing also receives huge subsidies. Now, the Quebec government, it invested $1 billion last year for a 49.5% stake in the C-Series program. And this year, Ottawa loaned $372.5 million to Bombardier, about a third of which was to be used for the C-Series. The U.S. Commerce Department made a preliminary decision yesterday to slap a 220% duty on Bombardier C-Series jets, which effectively raises the cost of importing them into the United States. It's a lot of math, it's a lot of fuss, and in response, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister says Canada strongly disagrees with that decision, pointing out that the C-Series jet supports an estimated 23,000 jobs in the United States, not to mention the thousands of jobs on this side of the border. So, could this U.S. move lead to job losses in Canada, and is Boeing's charge against Bombardier a legitimate one? Joining me now from Toronto is John Johnson. He's a legal advisor on the original Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, has spent years on the softwood dispute. He's also a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. And in Washington, Simon Lester. He's a trade policy analyst at the Cato Institute and an expert in trade disputes. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining us. Simon, I'd like to start with you. Let's step back a bit here to help our viewers understand some things. Why exactly is Boeing doing this? Is it really just crying foul over subsidies?
Well, look, it's widely known that the aircraft industry is heavily subsidized, and there have been decades of litigation at the WTO about this. Boeing's decided to take a more aggressive tact on this. They decided to use the anti-dumping countervailing duty laws to challenge these same subsidies that have been at issue in the WTO. It's a risk for them. As you've talked about, there's a lot of pushback, there's a lot of outrage in Canada and the UK about this new tactic. But I think that Boeing saw an opportunity here. They saw that these laws were available, and they saw a chance to attack the subsidies that their competitors receive in a way that doesn't really harm them. Their subsidies can't be challenged easily the same way. So they saw an opportunity, and they took it.
You know, John, I have a question, though, because Boeing doesn't make a similar jet. It isn't competing for that 100 to 115 seat plane that the C-Series is there. So why do you think they're going after Bombardier when they're not a direct competitor in this particular class of plane?
I think it's a preemptive strike, in a sense. The C-Series jet that Bombardier has developed is an entirely new aircraft. Bombardier started from scratch. Airframe manufacturers haven't done that for years. The competing product, which isn't competing, the 737, that's the closest product that Boeing has to what Bombardier is producing. It's been around for years. There have been endless derivatives of it, but essentially it's the same airframe. So I think that the C-Series is seen as being a significant threat because its performance specifications are better in a number of respects, simply because it's new, it's an entirely new aircraft. That is certainly a motivation for them to do what they're doing.
Okay, that's interesting. So, Simon, the Premier of Quebec, he said today, this is on the subsidies issue, said there are no subsidies, but his government did give Bombardier $1 billion. The federal government has given them some money. Are these subsidies, and are they unfair?
My sense is that they are subsidies, and various subsidies to Bombardier were litigated years ago at the WTO. It's pretty clear there are subsidies out there. The determination of whether they're unfair is much more difficult. The WTO has a whole set of rules about it. The U.S. countervailing duty law has a whole set of rules about it. we've seen from the Commerce Department so far is the number, 220%. That's the duties that they're going to impose. What we haven't seen yet is their reasoning, and that will be released soon. So how did they logically, go through this issue? How did they determine whether there were subsidies and what was the amount? And that, so, we'll see that soon from the Commerce Department. That's the kind of issue that U.S. courts or these NAFTA Chapter 19 panels can review and say, well, did the Commerce Department make an appropriate determination about whether these subsidies were unfair?
So, John, everybody talks about how the aerospace industry globally is heavily subsidized. The issue here is Bombardier and whether that's the case or not. But what about Boeing? People have been pointing out they get a lot of help, too.
One of the totally aggravating things about countervailing duty law is that the fact that the other guy is being subsidized is irrelevant. The Boeing answer would be, okay, Bombardier, if you think we're being subsidized, you can go to your own government and you can file a complaint, at least file a complaint that we're being subsidized, and you can take it from there. Unfortunately, there's no concept of set-off here where one party's subsidies and the other party's subsidies are offset, so you end up with a net. I think that idea has been floated from time to time, and of course categorically rejected by those who favor countervailing duty remedies.
Simon, there's a lot of jobs on the line here, right? I mean, we heard from the Foreign Affairs Minister, there's tens of thousands of jobs for Bombardier in the United States. So why is the U.S. Department of Commerce doing this when it could potentially have a negative job impact on their side of the border?
Well, I think the simple answer is that Boeing supports more jobs and is sort of a more influential, company within the United States. So there's no question that there's an opportunity for Bombardier to make its case. Now, it'll probably do so more when this dispute goes to the International Trade Commission. The issue there will be the impact on the domestic industry. At that point, Bombardier can come forward and say, look, we also support jobs here. You should be taking that into account. You're going to have a negative impact on U.S. jobs. But look, Boeing's the big player. Very influential. The laws are set up so that they can bring this case and claim injury to themselves, and the Commerce Department and the International Trade Commission to some extent are just sort of playing by the rules. There's a whole statute here. They're following it. The opportunity's out there for Boeing to bring the case. Again, they saw it and they took it.
So, John, this is all very complicated, these processes and adjudicating these, but what can Bombardier do here? Is there an appeal process? Can an appeal succeed?
Well, the first step is the injury hearing before the International Trade Commission. By the way, International Trade Commission, that's a U.S. body, and its responsibility is to determine whether subsidization is causing injury. Now, there are certainly apparent arguments here that Bombardier has in its favor in that this particular aircraft, namely the CS-100, does not directly compete with any aircraft that Boeing is currently producing. The closest that they came was the 717, which went out of production years ago. It would have been a direct competitor, but they don't make it anymore. So that is certainly an argument that Bombardier can raise. And I certainly wish them the best of luck on it because it makes some sense. It remains to be seen what the ITC will do. There's a whole series of steps that Bombardier can take after that could involve Chapter 19, could involve the domestic process in the U.S. for judicial review of these decisions.
Okay, Simon, this is all happening in the context of trade negotiations, NAFTA, the big trade deal is on the table. This is not a welcome development here in Canada. Are we headed towards a trade war between Canada and the U.S., possibly?
Possibly, but I tend to think the answer is no. These anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws tend to be a self-contained regime. I mean, I know Canada has seen this for years with the lumber dispute. You have this conflict over a particular product, lumber or aircraft, but hopefully the litigation process sort of keeps us away from a broader trade war. We litigate it in U.S. courts or in NAFTA or special arbitration mechanisms, but we don't let it spill over into the broader relationship. And hopefully that will be the case here. Clearly, the NAFTA negotiators will notice it, and Chapter 19 is an issue that's being talked about in the context of NAFTA. But I think, with any luck, and hopefully and most likely, this will sort of stay as a self-contained problem and not be, not get in the way of the NAFTA negotiations.
Okay, John, just a final point before we wrap this up. What do you think this might do to the NAFTA negotiations? Oh. Okay, I think we may have lost John. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to both of you, Simon Lester and John Johnson. Thanks for joining us on Power.